Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I would like to welcome all of you to my 500 Movies in 2025 series. And for this episode, this will be movies number 157 through 161. Um, and this is going to be a two-parter as well this week, so I'm going to be covering today's first five movies. I'm going to be talking about those tonight, and then the part two will be on Sunday. And the reason I changed this up a little bit is because tomorrow night, which is Thursday, which I normally do in my first stream of the week, I will be on Dead Pit. So I will be on Dead Pit tomorrow night. As we'll be ranking all of the WrestleManias, WrestleMania 1 through 40. So definitely tune into that over on the Dead Pit Radio channel here on YouTube. If you guys are into wrestling, or if you just want to maybe learn a little bit about wrestling from us talking about the WrestleManias. So yeah, definitely love to have you guys there for that. But like I said, that's why I'm doing this tonight. And I just did another stream, a really quick, about 10, 11-minute stream less than an hour ago, where I talked about the Minecraft movie, where me and my family went and watched that this past weekend. So if you want to check out my review for that, I'd love for you to check that out as well. But for tonight, like I said, this is part one of my sword and sorcery movies that I've watched and I'm going to be covering. And again, I don't know if I think I mentioned already, but this is number 157 through 161 of the 500 movies in 2025. But yeah, the sword and sorcery genre, my whole journey into this glorious and often cheesy, but always entertaining, like realm of this sword and sorcery movies didn't happen just like a lightning strike or anything. I mean, it was more like a slow burn for me, just kind of kindled by these childhood movies I'd watched, like Never Ending Story and Troll and Conan and the Hobbit cartoon. I mean, it was just all that kind of just came, it just kept building and building and building within me until really I got into high school, and it became this teenage obsession. And like I said, looking back at it, it all started with Conan, I think, for me. Because I was a big Arnold Schwarzenegger fan growing up. He's one of my all-time favorite actors. I love Arnold. And just as a kid, that whole visual of just Arnold Schwarzenegger as this like hulking warrior, just hacking and slashing, through all these villains and this kind of fantastical barbarian world was just captivating to me, and it was just pure unadulterated adventure, with swords and magic and just just all kinds of just really awesome sequences that happen in those Conan movies. It really planted this kind of seed of fascination, with this kind of larger than life, storytelling, fantasy storytelling. And, like I said, around the same time that the Hobbit cartoon movie, I think I remember renting it on VHS from the video store. Just, it's definitely, more whimsical and geared toward younger audiences. It still offered, that kind of essential ingredient, which is a quest in this fantastical world filled with mythical creatures and magic and all that. And Bilbo Baggins' journey through those as animated and more gentler, it still resonated with that kind of adventurous spirit that I glimpsed in Conan, just kind of in a in a different flavor, Um, and then there was the horror movie Troll. Um, so yes, it's technically a horror movie, more than Sword and Sorcery, but that Sword and Sorcery vibe is definitely, within the movie. And even as a kid, when I was watching that movie, I definitely sensed something kind of fantastical, lurking beneath all the rubber monsters and everything. There was, magic. There was these weird creatures. It just, it definitely had this kind of slightly off kilter, like low budget fantasy vibe. That in retrospect really feels oddly connected to some of the more, eccentric sword and sorcery films. Um, it was an unlikely, I think, getaway for me, but I think it broadened my definition of what fantasy on screen could be. Um, but however, this kind of went full throttle once I was in high school, and I think it really kind of really fueled this obsession for me because in high school I discovered Dungeons and Dragons, and being introduced to Dungeons and Dragons and get to play that with like-minded people that love the same thing. It was like I was being handed the keys to the kingdom. You know what I mean? Like suddenly, I wasn't just watching these heroes on TV and in movies and all that. I was making up my own hero, and I was imagining these worlds and creating these characters and just battling imaginary monsters. With my friends, it was just uh D&D, just I think turned passive enjoyment into active participation, and it just it really deepened my understanding of the genre and the themes of the genre. Just and the different character types and just just the sheer fun of all that kind of collaborative fantasy storytelling. Um, and also, while I was in high school, the Lord of the Rings trilogy was coming out. I think I was maybe like a sophomore, either a freshman or a sophomore when the first one, Fellowship of the Ring, came out. And for me and my friends who were into all that stuff at the time, instead of these just movies coming out, these became like events to us. And Peter Jackson's kind of epic adaptation brought Tolkien's world to life in a way that I could only have dreamed of. And it's that the Lord of the Rings trilogy is my favorite movie trilogy of all time. And I will be covering all those at some point in this year, somewhere probably closer to my birthday, because September I'm doing like a whole month of just all like my favorite things. So, but we'll get there when we get there. But now, like I was saying, like the whole scale and detail of the Lord of the Rings films, though, is just that and that dedication, to bring a Middle Earth to the screen to me was really breathtaking in a way. Um, it was like a master class in world building and heroic storytelling and that whole visual spectacle. Lord of the Rings was more than just a sword and sorcery series. It was kind of this just defining sword and sorcery movie experience. Um, and also around that same time, kind of riding that same wave, the Harry Potter movies, also were coming out. And I had read the first two books, I think, at that point when the movies came out, because the books started coming out in like the late 90s. But and I think it was like 2001 or something when the first Harry Potter movie came out. Um, and that whole series is kind of firmly rooted in like urban fantasy. They still share that essential magical DNA with all these sword and sorcery movies, and just watching, Hogwarts come alive, with the spells and all the creatures and the battles against Voldemort and other dark forces. Um, I think that just further cemented my love for the genre even more. And it just it broadened my whole appreciation for different shades of fantasy. Even if it leaned kind of less heavily into the sword aspect, but and more into the sorcery. Um, so from that whole barbaric grit of Conan to the like epic sweep of Lord of the Rings and just all that magical, whimsical type stuff in the Harry Potter films, and which is with kind of a detour through the whole bizarro world of Troll, because I talked about growing up with Troll, and the main character in that's name is Harry Potter Jr. So kind of ironic if you think about it. But my whole journey into the whole sword and sorcery movies was a very gradual, almost inevitable descent, into these fantastical worlds. Um, and it was, I think just a combination of, childhood exposure and exploration in my teenage years, and just, that sheer power of just cinematic storytelling that hooked me. And honestly, looking back, I think it's a journey that I wouldn't trade for anything. Just the genre with all of its kind of flaws and glories and cheesiness. It continues to hold a special place in my heart, and that's why I wanted to dedicate a whole week to these types of movies. Um, and it just all started with those early sparks, of these barbarian blades and hobbit adventures, and um, uh, also a slightly terrifying little troll played by Phil Fondacaro. Uh, but yeah, guys, this is one that I knew I was definitely going to come around to, and I did watch at least one movie of these first five I'm gonna be talking about this week for the first time. So, and I chose it because of the title. I wanted to start out this week of these sword and sorcery movies with this one in particular because it kind of plays into the name of the show. And this is the Sword and the Sorcerer from 1982. And this has Richard Lynch and Richard Mole. Um, and it was one I've never seen before, but I am glad I watched it. It didn't end up being one of my favorites of the sword and sorcery genre, but I think this is a very important movie to talk about. And just as a fan of sword and sorcery, I always kind of have this interest for the films that try to capture that genre's raw magic, just and the Sword and Sorcerer is definitely one of those movies. It's not a great movie, in my opinion, but it's got enough to kind of keep me interested. And if you're a fan of the genre, especially if you appreciate a bit of campiness, I think you would like it too. Um, the film dives headfirst into like all these classic themes of fantasy and sword and sorcery, and we've got this prince named Talon, um, and whether he starts out with the young version of it, I'm not sure the actor's name, but the older version of Talon for a majority of the movie is played by Lee Horsley. And Talon as a kid, he has been wronged, and he's returning years later now, grown up, to avenge his family and just reclaim his kingdom from this King Cromwell, who's played by Richard Lynch. And then you throw in this resurrected evil sorcerer, um, Zuja, who's played by Richard Mole. Just for extra chaos and kind of a potential triple threat situation. Um, and you've got a recipe for some old school uh, testosterone fueled fantasy, and just the plot itself I can't talk. Is fairly straightforward. I mean, there's revenge, there's rebellion, there's rescuing the damsel in distress. It hits all that familiar beats that a sword and sorcery fan expects. With betrayals and battles and just a dose of kind of mystical menace. And what immediately grabs you is, and probably what grabbed me, and other audiences, um, especially audiences back in 1982. Uh, I mean, it obviously didn't grab me in 1982 because I wasn't born yet, but but you know what I mean. But it's all the action that's featured here in this movie. The film doesn't shy away, from throwing bodies around. Sword fights are very frequent and energetic, and if not always the most elegantly choreographed, but let's be honest, the star of this show, of this whole movie, is Talon's iconic triple bladed sword. I mean, that was one of the first things that stood out to me for this movie, and it's just wonderfully impractical, and just over the top, and it's really a true symbol of like that whole '80s fantasy obsession that that people had back then, and just the practical effects here, while they kind of show their age for sure, they definitely have a certain charm that a lot of modern films nowadays are lacking of. And you can feel the impact in the punches and the stabs and all the creature work. And it's not groundbreaking or anything, but it definitely adds to the atmosphere of the movie. Um, and this isn't a masterpiece or anything, guys. So it's definitely not a film to approach with overly critical eyes and think it's going to get this Oscar worthy performance. But the acting in this is very enthusiastic. I really enjoyed it. I was entertained. There's moments of this genuine grit and like determination, but also plenty of very cheesy uh, dialogue and very wooden dialogue, and just um, the characters are fairly typical. There's the brooding hero, there's the ruthless villain, the sorcerer in the movie, just even the noble like rebel princess. They all serve their purpose in driving the plot forward. But just don't expect any kind of deep character development or anything like that. But for a modern audience, I think the Sword and Sorcerer can feel dated. I guess it's very much a product of its time, with that kind of low budget feel, and just it's definitely rough around the edges. Um, just the pacing can be a little uneven sometimes, and the story does feel a little loosely connected at times, and there are moments where you might kind of chuckle, at the ridiculousness of these um, certain plot points or lines of dialogue. But for me, and I think perhaps a lot of other Sword of Sorcery fans, I think that's definitely a part of the charm with these types of movies. It's very unpretentious. It's trying to be entertaining above all else, and I think it largely succeeds in that aspect. Um, but am I going to declare the Sword and the Sorcerer as this hidden masterpiece? No, I mean I would recommend it to a fellow Sword and Sorcery fan that was looking for something that was kind of nostalgic and slightly cheesy and action packed. Yeah, I would definitely recommend it. But it's a film that that leans into that whole genre's kind of pulpier side, and delivering on like the swords and sorcery and just all that dose of like '80s B movie energy. Um, so if you're going to watch this movie, I would say to go in with expectations for fun. Um, and you might just find yourself enjoying this. I mean, it's flawed, sure, but it's definitely entertaining. And I mean, it's not going to replace Conan the Barbarian in your heart or my heart or anything like that. But it very well could as well. That could be one of your favorite sword and sorcery movies of all time. But either way, I think it's definitely worthy piece of the genre that you should check out. Have a movie night with, especially with friends or family who appreciate that kind of those types of movies as well. I mean, and Albert Pun, I think it's how you say Albert Pun. I'm not sure how you say his last name, but he was the one that directed The Sword and the Sorcerer. Um, and he's a filmmaker who is primarily known for his kind of output in the realm of low budget action, sci-fi, and fantasy films. And he's also uh, he's always known for putting in his like martial arts elements in the movies as well. And I think while the Sword and the Sorcerer is arguably his most commercially successful and well known film from what I understand, um, he has directed a number of other movies, including he's worked with Jean Claude Van Damme. They did Cyborg in 1999, which is this post apocalyptic action movie with Jean Claude Van Damme. Uh, though I think I had read something that Penn had reportedly had his cut of the film like heavily altered. Or I'd like to look more into that. I'm not sure about that, but he also did several of the Kickboxer movies, including Kickboxer 2, 3, and 4. Um, but he's often kind of associated with these independent and direct-to-video filmmaking, and his films are characterized by their like low budget, fast paced action, and just some genre bending elements, definitely. And while he may not be like a household name or anything, I think he has somewhat of a fan base who appreciates his commitment to genre cinema, and just he has a very dynamic style. Just even with budgetary constraints, I think the Sword and Sorcerer stands out in his filmography as a kind of relatively higher profile project that kind of captured this very specific moment in 80s um, fantasy filmmaking. But the Sword and the Sorcerer, despite not being a critical, success, I think it carved out a very niche for itself and had a very noticeable, if perhaps not massive, impact. Particularly with the Sword and Sorcerer subgenre and just the whole landscape of the 80s, fantasy films. Because at the time, of its release, the Sword and Sorcerer was this kind of box office success, from what I understand, and especially considering its low budget, it demonstrated, I think, that there was still a market for these sword and sorcery films after that kind of initial wave of movies like Conan the Barbarian and Hawk the Slayer from 1980, and it proved that even without a huge studio backing them, there's this visually engaging, action-packed fantasy film that could find an audience. And over the years, I think this movie has probably developed a cult following. It's new to me, but I think I can definitely see this movie having a following. Because it's got really fun, like over the top action, cheesy dialogue. That whole 80s aesthetic is, and it's just become very endearing to a lot of viewers. Um, and it represents a very specific type of nostalgia for this fantasy filmmaking that resonates with audiences who grew up like myself, watching these kinds of films. And it's I think it's this would be one that I would definitely revisit from time to time, just for the its campiness value, and just that kind of attempt to deliver, a sword and sorcery adventure experience. And I like Richard Lynch a lot in this movie. I thought he did a great job as King Cromwell, and just the triple bladed sword. I mentioned that earlier, but just it is. I think it feels like it's probably iconic in the whole sword and sorcery like fan genre. Like I haven't talked with many people about this movie before. I mean, I've heard it mentioned several times, but I couldn't talk with people about it because I'd never seen it before this week. But I could definitely see this as being something that is iconic to the sword and sorcery, genre fans. Um, it shows that it's a prime example of that 80s fantasy creativity and just that over the top design, and I think it really definitely contributes to this film's kind of visual identity and just the memorability. So that's definitely something that's very memorable. Um, and I think in conclusion with the Sword and the Sorcerer, while like I said, it may not be this masterpiece or anything, I think it definitely has a legacy that kind of lies in surprising commercial success. Um, and it's just its influence on low budget genre filmmaking. From what I understand, it's just driven by all that nostalgia, that camp value and just that iconic nature of just of a triple bladed sword, I guess. Um, and to me, I think it was a film that definitely has that had its very specific moment in the 80s fantasy film world, and just yeah, I mean for sure. I mean, check this one out if you've never seen it. It was new to me, but this is definitely something that I'll be watching, uh, time and time again. But moving on, I guess I'll go on to the next movie I watched. And this next movie I have seen multiple times since I was a kid. This is another one just like I probably didn't watch this one as much as Conan. But this is definitely another one that I discovered probably in somewhere in the 90s. I watched this for the first time. I think it might have been on TV or something, maybe TBS or TNT or one of those channels. But I remember my dad liking this movie a lot too, so I think he was probably the one that was watching it, and I just decided to watch it with him, and said this is the Beastmaster from 1982, um, and the Beastmaster is kind of this nostalgic call to a simpler, more fantastical time in movies. Um, I mean, if you're seeking a movie, with these kind of heroic quests and these mystical villains and it's like loyal animal companions and just a huge dose, just thrill and action, then look no further than the Beastmaster from 1982 because it delivers a huge dose of just that classic genre goodness. And for the very first scene in the movie, the Beastmaster grabs you by the throat and hurls you into this kind of barbaric kingdom of Eric. And we're thrown straight into the action with these chanting witches, these dark prophecies, and there's this whole baby sacrificing sorcery that's going on. It's very unsettling, especially if you're a kid like me watching this. And I think, but it sets the perfect tone for the movie as we have Mayax, who is the uh, played by Rip Torn. He is just definitely a villain for the ages when it comes to the sword and sorcery genre. He's not just power hungry; he's driven by this kind of twisted religious obsession and a just a genuine fear that boils underneath that kind of oily charisma that he has. He's the kind of bad guy that you love to hate. Um, just a figure of pure evil who you desperately want to see get his in the end. And when that whole prophecy of King Zed's unborn son comes to pass, orchestrated through this kind of truly disturbing magical birth involving a cow, um, you're in for something special, though. This movie is visceral, raw, just unapologetically pulpy, and I think that's precisely why it works so brilliantly. Um, so there's your main character, Dar, who is played by Mark Singer, and he just kind of embodies the whole standard barbarian hero in a way that few others, I think, have managed. You can forget all these pretty boy heroes. Mark Singer in this is rugged and powerful and just possesses this kind of quiet intensity that definitely speaks volumes. He's the character Dar is definitely a man of few words, kind of letting his actions and his connection with animals do more of the talking. And what a connection it is. I mean, the core concept of the Beastmaster, this man who can speak with animals, I think is pure genius. It's the heart and soul of the film. You have Shirak, who is the eagle, and is very majestic and loyal, um, to Dar, and you have Kodo and Podo, the ferret duo. And I'm pretty sure this was the reason why I wanted to end up getting a ferret, because I had a ferret as a pet many years ago, and that I named Zira after Zira from Planet of the Apes. Um, and was she was really one of the best pets that I ever had, and I really think that the Beastmaster inspired that. But yeah, you have both Kodo and Podo, they're the ferret duo companions to Dar in this movie, and they're definitely like this kind of constant source of comedic relief, and they're surprisingly effective thieves in the movie as well. So then you have Ruh, who is supposed to be a panther, but it really looks like a black tiger to me. Um, and Ruh is kind of this very sleek, silent shadow of deadly grace. And these aren't pets really. These are more like partners to Dar, extensions of Dar himself. Kind of each with their own personality and just this kind of vital role to play in Dar's quest for vengeance. Um, and just the bond between Dar and these animal companions is very touching at times, and just the way they interact in combat, and all that exploration is consistently inventive here, and I love it. And who needs a party of elves and dwarves when you got a bunch of animals at your side? You know what I mean? Um, and on top of that, there's the world building. While it's not like Tolkien esque in its depth, it still perfectly resonates with the audience. And the whole world of Eric feels genuinely lived in, like a land on the brink of chaos, just teetering between these kind of ancient traditions and just a brutal new order that's imposed, by Mayax and his hordes of the Jun hordes. So the Juns themselves are fantastic villains. They're very savage and barbaric and just relentless as hell. Uh, they embody this whole threat of chaos and destruction. Just I think that contrasts with the more subtle evil of Mayhex. And let's not forget that unforgettable the Birdmen. These creatures are this kind of um, the epitome of these practical effects and that sheer weirdness that's in these types of movies, and just it really adds kind of a unsettling, otherworldly element to this world of Eric. Just they're eerie, you know, this little like strange, they they look like, I don't know, they're like what they're supposed to be, like eagles or what they. Not sure what but they're just really weird looking bird men, and I think, but by having them in there really solidifies the Beastmaster's place in that realm of truly unique fantasy films. Um, but the plot itself is just your classic revenge story um, in sword and sorcery films, which is elevated by all that those fantasy elements, and excuse me. Dar's journey, from kind of this grieving survivor to this avenging hero, is compelling, I think, and just his encounters along the way are definitely engaging. Because you got Tanya Roberts, and this who I love. If you know me, you know that I love Tanya Roberts. She plays Kiri in this, and she brings this much needed spark of wit and intelligence to the proceedings. I think she's no damsel in distress or anything, but she's this very resourceful slave girl with kind of her own techniques, and her relationship with Dar is both believable and charming. And then you have John Amos in this as well, who plays Seth, and that character of Seth really provides kind of a solid dose of grounded wisdom and just this warrior prowess. Just and it really just adds another layer of texture to Dar's kind of growing band of allies. Um, and the action sequences here, while they're not on that whole blockbuster scale, they're still wonderfully choreographed and very impactful. Especially if you're, to a kid who was growing up watching these movies. Um, and like I said, when I was a kid, I watched this. It was on TV, so all like the nudity parts and stuff were of course edited out for TV. But as I got older, I watched this movie again, unedited, and I definitely got to enjoy those parts as well. Um, but in this movie, Dar he has a very acrobatic fighting style. And I think that that's combined with that assistance and his animal companions, and that's definitely a joy to watch. I love seeing how everything is kind of choreographed here in this movie. Um, and Dar he's not just hacking and slashing. He's very this cunning warrior who utilizes his unique abilities to outsmart and outmaneuver all of his enemies, and just the whole siege of Eric and the final confrontation that he has with Mayax are genuinely exciting parts of the film. Um, and just the special effects here are again clearly of their time, but again, like I said, that's part of the charm. That's definitely part of the charm with these movies, especially the ones that are from the '80s. They're just very practical, they're tactile, and just and really imbued with this raw creativity that is, I think is often lacking in today's kind of overly polished productions. Um, the low budget actually, I think enhances the film's gritty and like down to earth feel, which makes those kind of fantastical elements feel even more impactful. Um, so this movie was directed by Don Coscarelli. And while the Beastmaster is a beloved cult classic, I think Coscarelli is perhaps best known for his Phantasm film series, at least in the horror fan world. I covered the first four Phantasm movies earlier this year here on the channel, so if you want to go check those out, it was one of the first videos that I ever did in the 500 movies in 2025 series. So yeah, it's the first four Phantasm, and I love Don Coscarelli. I got to meet Don Coscarelli last year at Scarefest in Lexington, and he was one of the best like celebrity experiences that I've ever had. He was such a nice guy. Um, but like I said, I'm mainly a fan for him for the Phantasm movies, and Phantasm is I think highly influential, and it's just this very enduring horror franchise that is known for its kind of surreal imagery and just its that nightmarish atmosphere and just all of its practical effects and Coscarelli often writes and directs and produces his own films, and I think that showcases a very strong vision. His work, including the Phantasm movies and Bubba Hotep. They often blend genres, incorporating elements of horror and sci-fi and fantasy with just a with a very distinct and sometimes quirky sensibility to his films. Um, and his background in horror might explain some of the darker and more unsettling elements that's presented in the Beastmaster, um, such as the Birdmen, and the whole sacrificial rituals, which I think those elements of the film really give it this unique edge within the sword and sorcery genre. Um, and the Beastmaster, I think, is cultivated a very significant and enduring legacy as a cult classic. Despite not being a massive box office hit, when it was released, I still think it found immense popularity and just a dedicated fan base through cable television, which is where I saw it for the first time. Um, and just that whole repeated exposure, in the 1980s introduced this movie to a vast audience and just really cemented its place in pop culture consciousness, in my opinion. Um, I think for many, the Beastmaster is just a huge piece of nostalgia, and it just represents that whole quintessential sword and sorcery adventure, of people's childhoods. And just like I said about me watching it for the first time on TV, just that influence that it had on that cable television fantasy. Like, I think the success that it had on cable, arguably helped pave the way for other fantasy and genre films, to kind of find a wider audience outside of these theatrical releases. Especially during the rise of home video and cable TV, and it just I think it demonstrated that appeal of these genres to a home viewing market. And just the whole theme with the animal companions, the strong bond that Dar has with them is definitely become a defining characteristic of this film. And yeah, I think it has influenced um, it it's influenced I think a lot of other fantasy works featuring like animal sidekicks. And you know while it's not the first to utilize this thing, the Beastmaster definitely presented it in a memorable and impactful way. I think that that resonated with audiences everywhere. And the film's popularity based off of all that, has led to several sequels as well. There's a Beastmaster 2, Through the Portal of Time, and Beastmaster 3, the Eye of the Braxis. And there was even a television series of the Beastmaster, I think that ran for 3 seasons. Um, Now, while these sequels and spin-offs and it's varied in quality, um, they demonstrate that lasting appeal of the original film and the concept that it had. And I think that's very cool. I think the Beastmaster's legacy is not one of like blockbuster dominance or anything, but it's rather one of this kind of cult devotion, and just has this very enduring charm. And I think it's a film that definitely resonated with my generation and multiple other generations, through TV, and just continues to be celebrated. I think for its very classic sword and sorcery adventure, and it's um, that's just a huge embrace, of the genre's themes. Um, I think it stands as a testament to just the power of practical filmmaking and just that enduring appeal of a good old fashioned heroic quest. So yeah, definitely the Beastmaster is probably one of the greatest sword and sorcery films of all time. But moving on now, we're going to talk about a movie that I just watched for the first time last year, I believe. I believe it was last year. And not sure how I missed this one, because this is not one of the greatest made sword and sorcery films of all time, but this is one of my favorites. This is one of my favorite sword and sorcery films of all time. It's very cheesy. Um, it's like I said, it's not super well made. Um, and and as a fan of sword and sorcery movies, like when I first watched this last year, I thought I'd seen it all. The epic masterpieces, the valiant attempts, at the genre, and just just let's say the unique entries. And Deathstalker firmly resides in that wildly entertaining and undeniably cheesy, unique category. Um, And I say that, like I said, I love this movie. So I say all that with just absolute genuine affection. Um, if you're looking for a masterpiece, look elsewhere. So, but if you kind of crave a pulpy, sword clashing, monster battling adventure with a dose of 80s schlock and a hell of a lot of sex and female nudity, um, then Deathstalker is the one to check out for sure. Um, so from the opening moments of this movie, you're thrown head first into this kind of low budget fantasy world. We meet Deathstalker, who is played with this kind of imposing physique and charm by Rick Hill. And he's a wandering warrior, a classic barbarian hero for hire. Um, think Conan the Barbarian, but on a cheap budget. So Rick Hill embodies the role perfectly. He's got the muscles, the attitude, the almost comical seriousness that the part requires. Um, he's not the greatest actor in the world, but he is Deathstalker, and that's precisely what this film needs. So our story is pretty straightforward. It kicks off this quest, which is the foundation of any good sword and sorcery movie. And Deathstalker is tasked with acquiring the legendary Amulet of Life, the Chalice of Magic, and the Sword of Justice. And these aren't just any ordinary items. They are powerful artifacts that are sought after by the sorcerer Munkar. And the quest itself is a classic setup, providing a loose framework to hang a series of these adventures upon. Um, Along the way, Deathstalker, he encounters a cast of colorful characters who are as over the top as the film itself. We have Princess Codille, who's portrayed by Barbie Benton. Now, Benton's background is, well, let's just say she wasn't known for her sword and sorcery prowess. She was a Playboy playmate. And I talked about her previously in my review of X-Ray / Hospital Massacre on the Valentine's Day special earlier this year. Um, so if you haven't watched that, definitely go check it out and hear me talk more about Barbie Benton in that video. But then there's Kyra, who's played by this beautiful Lana Clarkson, and we're introduced to Kyra as this scantily clad warrior woman who's wearing nothing but a cloak and a g-string, and she brings a slightly otherworldly quality to that role. Even in the midst of the film's more ludicrous moments, and both Barbara Benton and Lana Clarkson are very refreshing additions to the film, uh, and bring a very welcoming spark of to that whole male dominated world of Deathstalker. So you remember when I said there's a hell of a lot of sex and female nudity in this? Well, both of those characters definitely contribute to that, and I think the film would also launch the career of Lana Clarkson, who became this kind of recognizable cult celebrity in the sword and sorcery genre because um, Roger Corman, who was producer on this, she would later work with Roger Corman again on the Barbarian Queen films. Um, and then out of all the characters, lastly, I want to talk about Ogress, who is played by Richard Brooker. And Ogress is this kind of brute force, very powerful warrior in his own right. And Richard Brooker, who plays him, is known to many horror fans as Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th Part 3. And he definitely brings a similar physicality to that role of Ogress. Um, he's this classic, sword and sorcery warrior, clad in leather, wielding a blade, and just Richard Brooker in this is thoroughly committed to the role. So I really enjoy seeing him in this. Other because the only other thing I know from him is Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th Part 3. Um, But the plot with this movie, it unfolds in this kind of series of episodic encounters as Deathstalker is seeking out all these different artifacts, and just the pacing it keeps things moving very quickly here. Um, rather than kind of letting the story slow down, the dialogue is often hilariously straightforward. Just the special effects are very low budget. The costumes are kind of a patchwork of like leather and fur and whatever else they could find, I guess. Um, but again, like I said, this is all part of the charm of these movies, especially this movie in particular, because it's a movie that fully embraces its kind of B movie origins and and runs with them. It's never pretending to be something that it's not. So I thought that was I love this movie, and the director who was behind this grand adventure is credited to John Watson, which was a pseudonym for James Sabar Delati, I think is how you say it. So yeah, he changed. He was credited to John Watson because I guess it was easier for people to pronounce, for me at least. But Sabar Delati, if that's how you pronounce his name, his whole filmography um, might not be filled with household names. Uh, especially within the context of Deathstalker. Um, but his direction is very effective. I think he understands those core elements of the whole sword and sorcery genre. Just focusing on action and atmosphere, and just a sense of relentless forward momentum. Um, and like I said, the film doesn't slow itself down with these overly complex stories or dialogue. Instead, it kind of prioritizes, delivering a very thrilling and visually engaging experience. And the director here, under the name John Watson, I think masterfully, captures that essence of a classic sword and sorcery tale. Just kind of creating that world, that feels both dangerous and alluring at times. Um, and he uses the locations and the sets just to their full potential here. Kind of crafting a very believable fantasy environment. Even with these kind of budgetary constraints, um, just the action sequences. Are very crucial here. To and like any other sword and sorcery film, and they're very well choreographed and super exciting, and just showcases I think both Deathstalker's skill, um, and the brutal ferocity of his enemies. So the director here, he has this very clear vision to just deliver this pure, unadulterated, sword and sorcery entertainment, and in this, I think he succeeds. You know, um, admirably, in my opinion. Um, but Deathstalker's legacy, I think, is firmly rooted in that whole realm of cult classic cheesy B movies. It's not a film that's revolutionized cinema or even the sword and sorcery genre. Um, but however, I think it has definitely carved out a niche for itself through its kind of sheer um, low budget charm, and just that embracing these different themes in the genre with kind of a wink and a grin, kind of tongue in cheek. Um, I could definitely get that vibe, especially with this being a Roger Corman produced film. That's just the type of guy that Roger Corman was. And he, to me, Roger Corman is one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. Um, but with Deathstalker, this was the first film in a surprisingly long running low budget franchise. It spawned three sequels: Deathstalker 2, which is this completely different cast and a more comedic tone. And then you have Deathstalker 3 and the Warriors from Hell with John Allen Nelson as the Deathstalker. And then finally, Deathstalker 4, Match of Titans, which also saw John Allen Nelson returning in the lead role. Um, but while none of those sequels reached massive mainstream success, they definitely kept the Deathstalker name alive, and just I think contributed to its kind of low budget cult status. Um, and the movie is also a perfect example of the kind of sword and sorcery films that emerged in the whole wake of Conan the Barbarian, but were operating on this kind of fraction of the budget, and I think it exemplifies that whole genre's tendency towards muscular heroes and fantastical creatures and simplistic good versus evil story. But it all delivers with these practical effects and just like I said, that often tongue in cheek humor. So I think this movie definitely sits comfortably alongside other similar films from the era, such as Sword and the Sorcerer and the BeastMaster, and just it definitely contributes to that whole overall landscape of these '80s fantasy B movies. Um, but over time, I think that Deathstalker has garnered a cult following as well. Particularly among fans of cheesy movies and so bad it's good movies. It's low budget. Sometimes kind of wooden acting, I guess you could say. There's rubbery monsters all over the place and just very hilarious dialogue, which is but all of those are part of the charm. Some people may see those as flaws, but I just all those things is what I find endearing about the film and why it's so special to me. Um, it's a film I think that's enjoyed ironically by a lot of people, but also kind of genuinely appreciated for its commitment to entertaining audiences, despite its limitations. And this so bad it's good reputation has helped it kind of endure and find new audiences through home video and streaming and just and late night screenings and all kinds of stuff like that. Um, but as I stated before, this being a Roger Corman production is a significant part of the whole legacy of Deathstalker. Um, Roger Corman's New World Pictures was legendary for producing low budget genre films that often served as launch pads for many now famous filmmakers and actors. Uh, Bruce Dern's definitely one of them because he was a good friend for many years of Roger Corman's. They worked together many times. Um, and this Deathstalker is a prime example, of Roger Corman's, efficient and resourceful filmmaking style. I think, it showcases his ability to create this kind of entertaining genre um, on shoestring budgets, and just emphasizing action and exploitation elements to kind of attract audiences. And it definitely works. I mean, it's Roger Corman. Almost all of his films all have these huge uh, cult followings, especially with like the whole mutant community. The drive-in community, and Joe Bob Briggs. And he, on his couple of years ago, I guess at his Joe Bob's Jamboree, they had Roger Corman as a guest. So, and that's one of my favorite interviews that I've ever watched with any celebrity. Just that interview that Joe Bob does with Roger Corman is amazing. I suggest checking it out. But in conclusion, Deathstalker is not a masterpiece or anything, but um, it's just this very charming, entertaining piece of '80s sword and sorcery schlock. Um, for fans of the genre who can appreciate this healthy dose of cheese and low budget filming, uh, it's such a fun movie to watch. Um, so just just don't go in expecting Lord of the Rings or Conan the Barbarian or anything like that. But if you're ready for some B movie barbarian battles and cheesy monsters and just some big old titties, then then Deathstalker. Hey, I'm just being honest, guys. I mean, there's a lot of that, so just be prepared if that's something you're interested in watching. Um, this movie is definitely for you. It's ready to deliver a good time. Just remember to bring your sense of humor and just prepare for a wild B movie ride. Um, so hell yeah, Deathstalker, and like I said, definitely check out the sequels as well because they're just equally as fun. I think. Um, but now moving on to the last two that I'm gonna be talking about, and this first one is definitely up there. I mean, in the top three, uh, well, top five, maybe top three, yeah. Um, sword and sorcery films of all time. I mean, I think this is one that really sparked the interest for these films, and just really, set the bar, paved the way. And I'm a fan of many sword and sorcery movies. I feel like I've seen, oh my God, so many of that movies from that genre. Um, just this movie, Conan the Barbarian from 1982, is just another level. I mean, just it's another level of sword and sorcery, and just has one of the greatest stories ever told in a sword and sorcery film. So prepare to be transported to a brutal and breathtaking world unlike you've ever seen before. Conan the Barbarian is this visceral journey into the Hyborian Age, um, which teams with myth and magic and just raw, untamed power. From the opening moments in this movie, you're just plunged into this kind of saga of vengeance that unfolds with the like, epic sweep of this classic poem and this gritty realism of this kind of blood-soaked battlefield. Um, so we see the origin story of Conan, and he is this he becomes this legendary figure who's carved from hardship and driven by this unyielding quest for justice. Um, we witness the seeds of his legend early in the movie when he's a child, and as he's kind of sown in tragedy, and as this young boy's peaceful life is shattered, by just this unimaginable violence. Seeing both of his mother and his father being killed. And just from these ashes, a warrior is forged, literally and figuratively. Just the film masterfully charts Conan's transformation from enslaved child to this formidable gladiator, and finally to a free man, seeking out his destiny. And um, this whole odyssey is not rushed. It's just meticulously crafted. It allows you to witness Conan's growth and strength and resilience and just that just everything that goes with that. You know what I mean? Like the visuals here are just simply stunning throughout the film. Just you forget these kind of sterile sets and this polished CGI that people are so used to nowadays. Conan the Barbarian immerses you in this world of like kind of tangible grit and these breathtaking landscapes and just from the just the bone chilling desolation of the frozen north to the opulent yet decadent cities of Zamora. Every location feels real and lived in and impactful here. Um, just the attention to detail is remarkable. From the intricate costumes and weaponry to just the sheer scale of the sets. And this is just a world that you can almost reach out and touch. It's like a testament to that power of practical effects and just visionary production design, I think. Hey Dana, how's it going? Glad to have you in here tonight. Yep. Just I seen that you just got done doing a stream, Dana. So once I get done with this one, I'm gonna go check yours out for tonight. Sorry about that. I couldn't be in there tonight while you were doing it live. Um, I was just trying to prepare for this one that I was doing tonight. But glad to have you stop by for just a second. I appreciate that. Um, but back to what I was saying, beyond that whole spectacle, I think that this film kind of delves in that kind of profound themes of the whole sword and sorcery genre. It grapples with that whole nature of strength, which is found solely in, like, the steel and muscle and or there's kind of this deeper, more primal force at play there. So the whole riddle of steel thing that's introduced in the film's opening uh, is not just any kind of throwaway line or anything. It's this kind of philosophical thread that's woven into the story and just kind of prompts you as the viewer to kind of reflect on what truly endures and what empowers us. Um, so like there's these themes of like vengeance and loyalty and just that whole corrupting influence of power uh throughout the film, and all that stuff resonates deeply, I think, giving the film a very surprising depth beyond its kind of action packed surface here. um and the characters throughout the film are very captivating. um Conan himself is this kind of magnetic presence. Everybody in the movie, everybody watching the movie, are all kind of drawn to him because he's evolved from this man of few words to this strategist, this leader. He is surrounded by several other characters that are very memorable to the film. Each with their own motivations and just their own complexities. And the alliances that are kind of forged here, they're tested, ultimately define that course of, Conan's journey. And you definitely become invested in all of their fates. I know I am for sure. Every time I watch this movie, and so you're going along for the ride with them, and you're sharing their triumphs and just kind of feeling the sting of their losses as well. So, and that's what I love so much about this movie. And there's just these moments of intense action and just thrilling adventure, and just Conan is more than just a sword and sorcery film. I feel like it's kind of this carefully constructed myth, like this tapestry that's woven with kind of threads of heroism and tragedy and just that enduring human spirit. It's a film, I think, that stays with you for a very long time. I mean, this has stayed with me for over 30 years since I saw this as a kid. Um, it's it really prompts you to kind of ponder the nature of strength and vengeance and just these enduring legends that kind of shape our imaginations. Um, and if you're seeking this truly epic and kind of visually stunning film with kind of these very rich um, atmospheres and this rich experience to it all. I think Conan the Barbarian is an absolute must see for anyone that has, if you haven't slightly have an interest in the whole sword and sorcery genre. It's definitely one of the must sees, one of the top movies that you should watch within that genre. And this movie was directed by John Milius. Now, while he perhaps not a household name or anything in the same vein as like some other blockbuster directors. Um, Milius is highly influential, I feel, and a very distinctive filmmaker known for his kind of strong and often controversial perspectives, and just his whole mastery of like the whole action driven stories with this philosophical vibe to him. You know what I mean? Um, I think he's often associated with kind of certain brand of like masculine cinema, um, exploring things of like honor and duty and individualism and all that. Um, but he's renowned for his kind of love of these firearms and military history as well. In his films, um, often kind of incorporating these elements into his own work. And although he has directed fewer films than some of like his contemporaries, I think his impact is kind of undeniable here. Um, I mean, he was the writer of Apocalypse Now from 1979, and even though that movie was directed by Francis Ford Coppola, uh, John Milius was instrumental, I think, in shaping the script and the themes of that movie. And just his influence is evident in the film's, kind of exploration of these primal instincts and the descent into savagery with Conan. And he also was the director of Red Dawn from 1984 too. Red Dawn is like this Cold War action film, about a Soviet invasion of the United States that became a cult classic pretty much, and it's another example of his interest in like military themes and that stories of resonant or resistance and all that. Um, and what else did he do? Oh, he was the writer of I think the first couple Dirty Harry movies. I know he was a writer of the first Dirty Harry for sure. Um, and he which I think it really helped that define the whole tough, morally ambiguous action hero when that movie came out. And just his whole directorial style is I think is characterized by his attention to detail, his ability to create a kind of sense of realism and authenticity, and just his focus on these strong central characters um, that face these extraordinary circumstances. Conan the Barbarian perfectly embodies these qualities, showcasing that talent for creating these epic adventures with a visceral impact, I guess. Um, and the movie really arrived at a very pivotal point in both movie and pop culture. See, the late 1970s and early 1980s just saw a resurgence of interest in these fantasy and sort of sorcery type films, and just it was fueled by the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons, and just and also fantasy literature, especially Tolkien and Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, um, and also because of the success of films like Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark, which really demonstrated that the audience's appetite for epic adventure, on screen with those movies. So definitely they were going to be something that would appeal to them with this as well. Um, but the source material here, so the film was this project to bring Robert E. Howard's iconic Conan character just to the big screen, and Robert E. Howard's pulp stories, known for this raw energy, brutal action, just mythic atmosphere, really just provided such rich and source material, for this film to be made. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, the casting of Arnold Schwarzenegger, this was his breakout role. When he was casted to be in the lead role, I think it just proved to be a stroke of genius here. While Schwarzenegger was known for like bodybuilding, he wasn't a major movie star yet. And Conan the Barbarian provided him with this kind of perfect opportunity to showcase his imposing physique and just this awesome screen presence. Um, the role was just kind of tailor made for his physical attributes and just kind of helped launch him into that superstardom for sure. Um, and Conan, I think the movie relied heavily on practical effects and just these elaborate sets, and just the stunning like location shooting. I mean, it's um, the all of the film sets here in this movie look fantastic. Um, I just think all that it contributes significantly to the film's kind of immersive and believable world. Just the production design here was inspired by historical and these mythical cultures, and it really created this very unique um, and visually stunning aesthetic. Um, I always tell people when it comes to these sword and sorcery films that the world of Conan is one of my like one of the most visually appealing worlds that exists in the genre. Um, and then to add on top of all of that, you have this epic like score that's composed for the film, and to me, I think it's considered one of the greatest film scores of all time. Um, I think it perfectly captures that kind of that brutality and emotional depth of the film, and it instantly is iconic to me. Um, but the movie is widely regarded as a landmark fantasy film that kind of significantly influenced the sword and sorcery genre in movies, and I think it also raised the bar for production values and that whole visual spectacle and just that thematic depth in fantasy filmmaking for sure. Um, just that aesthetic and the characters and just the world building have this very lasting influence on fantasy games and video games and comic books and just and all kinds of other stuff. It's definitely very gritty and it's realistic depiction of this fantasy world diverged from more whimsical or cartoonish portrayals, and it really sets a new tone. And you know, going back to what I said about you being influenced on like the games, comic books, and other stuff like that, just because it kind of came from that whole um, inspiration of the popularity with Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, look at the show Stranger Things, and I mean that whole series of Stranger Things is just based around the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons. So, and I mean, it's definitely um, something to thank for the whole sword and sorcery genre becoming as popular as it is Dungeons and Dragons, and you know ironically, like I talked about earlier in the stream, that was one of the reasons why I got so big into the sword and sorcery genre was because of Dungeons and Dragons. Um, but furthermore, going back to talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger and his whole star power, um, the role of Conan the Barbarian, um, I think it cemented his status as this leading action star, and just paved the way for that blockbuster career. In films like The Terminator and The Predator and Total Recall and everything else that would come after that. Um, so yeah, it's super cool that this movie, as great as this movie is, this is the movie that people can look back and say that's the movie that made Arnold a star. Um, and I think despite initial mixed uh, critical reactions to this movie, because I think I read that some critics found this movie to be too violent or simplistic or some shit like that. Um, but it definitely, above all else, has this very devoted cult following to it. Um, and over time, critical appreciation has grown, and just the film um, has I think it's now celebrated for its craftsmanship, and just kind of that enduring appeal to it. Um, just the themes that the movie has in it, like the themes of like revenge and loss, and just exploration of these different forms of strength, like physical, mental, spiritual. Um, I think that all resonates with audiences, and and just really contributes to the film's lasting impact. Just that whole there's philosophical questions that are kind of raised here as you're watching the movie, like by the whole riddle of steel thing, and that really adds this whole layer of depth beyond all the action in the movie. Um, but I guess to kind of wrap this up in conclusion, Conan the Barbarian is just this very cinematic milestone that redefined the genre. It launched a superstar. It continues to inspire and just captivate, audiences. I think decades later, including myself, and it just has this impact on on the whole fantasy film world, and just popular culture is just undeniable. So, and it just all of that just solidifies this movie as a true classic. Um, and just to follow up on that, brings us to our last movie of the night, and that is the sequel to the film we just talked about. This is Conan the Destroyer from 1984. So, if you love the first film, then definitely, get ready for this kind of adventure through a land of magic, monsters, and these mighty warriors with Conan the Destroyer. Um, as it takes us on this kind of captivating new journey with the iconic Sumerian. And it's a spectacle, that deserves a fresh look if you haven't seen it in a while. Um, it builds upon that world that that's established in the first film, and the sequel carves out kind of its own unique path, offering a more distinct and thoroughly enjoyable experience, I think, for in some aspects. Um, this time around, Conan, again played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, finds himself entangled in these kind of schemes of Queen Teramis of Shadowzar, who is played by Sarah Douglas. You may know her as Ursa from the Superman films, or a movie that I covered earlier this year on the channel, Solar Babies. Um, but you're lured into this whole tantalizing promise of resurrecting Conan's beloved Valyria, and Conan embarks on this perilous quest in the film. He's tasked with escorting this young princess Jenna, who's played by Olivia Dabo, who you may know as Karen Arnold from the Wonder Years. But he's escorting her. She's this kind of figure of destiny uh, to retrieve this legendary jeweled horn, and the adventure is it's far from simple here. Um, it's it's a classic treasure hunt, if you will, kind of woven with these trials and combat and cunning and mystical encounters. Um, and I think what truly elevates Conan the Destroyer is the cast that joins our hero, in this movie. We see this kind of ever resourceful thief named Malik, who is played by Tracy Walter, you may know as Bob the Goon from the 1989 Batman Tim Burton film. Um, he kind of provides the comic relief here, providing kind of witty banner and practical skills, and just and also we get the return of the wise and enigmatic wizard Akiro, which was played by Mako, and same in the first film. And there's other new faces that are introduced to the story as well, like Captain Bombada, who's played by NBA legend Wilt Chamberlain here. And also you got this fierce warrior woman, Zula, played by Grace Jones. And they each bring their own strengths and complexities to the journey here. Um, just the interplay between these characters is definitely a highlight. I think kind of it creates this very vibrant group whose interactions are as engaging as the main quest itself. And the film masterfully, I think, balances action with intrigue and kind of a touch of the fantastical from rescuing Akiro from this like savage tribe who were, I guess, were trying to eat him or something. I'm not sure. Um, to kind of navigating this, these corridors of this sorcerer's ice castle, and each set piece is visually impressive here, and propels the story forward. And the challenges that Conan and his party here face are very exciting. It showcases this his brute strength and just developing this strategic thinking. You'll witness kind of these thrilling sword fights. Encounter with bizarre creatures and these just these magical traps, just to kind of test the limits of all of their abilities. And the film never loses momentum, from what I can tell. As many times as I've watched it over the years, it really keeps you invested in the quest and just the fate of this kind of band of adventurers, if you will. Um, and while the story is driven by this kind of external goal of retrieving this horn, uh, it also explores these really deeper themes of like loyalty and sacrifice and just that whole allure of power. And Conan's motivations are still rooted in like his past love with Valeria, but his interactions with Jenna and the other characters very subtly kind of explore his capacity for compassion and even leadership. And Jenna herself, is more than just a damsel in distress here. She kind of displays this very growing technique and curiosity that really adds another layer to all the events that are unfolding here. Um, and this whole adventure was brought to life by uh, the director Richard Fleischer. And Richard Fleischer is, was a seasoned filmmaker at this point, known for uh, spanning various genres of film. He was the director behind classics like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, uh, which I think showcased his talent for the kind of grand spectacle and adventure. And he also directed the Fantastic Voyage, and I think that movie really kind of demonstrated his ability to blend science fiction with these very captivating visuals. And um, he also did movies like the Vikings and Tora. But yeah, I mean he really knew what he was doing uh, when when he tackled this film. Um, and if you want to go even further into kind of genre territory, he also directed Soylent Green, which is this chilling dystopian thriller, and he even returned to the whole sword and sorcery genre later, after this movie with Red Sonja, which I will be covering on part two this Sunday. But his whole extensive experience, and that diverse portfolio kind of shines through in Conan the Destroyer. Um, he handles the pacing and the action sequences and just the character dynamics here, just kind of creating this film that is both entertaining and visually engaging. He brings this classic Hollywood sensibility to the sword and sorcery genre, and I think that ensures a very kind of robust and dynamic adventure. Um, but the movie stands, I think, as a significant entry in the Conan cinematic universe. Um, while it might be perceived as having a slightly lighter tone compared to the original film, it definitely expands the world and kind of broadens the whole scope of Conan's adventures on screen. Um, it moved beyond this whole solitary, barbarian stereotype and kind of presented Conan as a part of a team, and showcasing his ability to work alongside and even inspire others. So I thought that was a definitely. I've always thought that's a really cool aspect to the film. And historically, the film arrived at a time when fantasy cinema was just gaining all this traction, and just a lot of people were becoming highly interested in these types of films, and just building on that success of the first Conan film and just all these other fantasy epics. Conan the Destroyer really contributed to solidifying the genre's appeal within the mainstream. Um, it offered a more accessible and perhaps family friendly adventure when it comes to the Conan series, and it just really kind of broadened that audience, out for more of these sword and sorcery stories. Um, and I think there's a lot of fans that might debate that its place in the Conan canon due to its kind of slightly different tone, but I think the legacy is undeniably positive in in the terms of like entertainment value. Um, it really provided, I think, audiences with all these thrilling action sequences, these memorable characters, and it just has a really well paced story. Um, I mean, it cemented Arnold Schwarzenegger's iconic portrayal of Conan and just really offered a different perspective of the character, just really showing his growth and adaptability in the face of all these new challenges. And just the film's impact can also be seen kind of in its contribution to the visual language of fantasy movies. Just the creature designs, the set pieces, the costume work, were rooted in these kind of 1980s aesthetic, and just they were very influential in shaping that look and feel of all of the fantasy adventures to come in film. And I think that really delivers, a whole like something that's more accessible. This is demonstrating that high potential for a larger scale fantasy storytelling on film. And we see that years later when we got the Lord of the Rings films, when we got the Harry Potter films. And I just feel like this series of movies, Conan the Barbarian, Conan the Destroyer, they're really what just set set the tone for everything to come after that in the sword and sorcery genre. But I guess in conclusion, Conan the Destroyer is thoroughly enjoyable to me, and just I think it's a very exciting fantasy adventure. Um, it's a film that delivers, on its promise of action and intrigue and just these fantastical encounters. And it's all anchored by this charismatic cast and just the iconic Conan himself. Whether you're a diehard Conan fan or you're simply just seeking this very thrilling and visually captivating quest, then this film is well worth revisiting if you haven't seen it in a while, or and it's definitely worth appreciating for its kind of unique place in that whole realm of fantasy films. Um, so if you've not seen this movie before, prepare to be swept away on this kind of journey of full on danger, camaraderie, and just the enduring strength of the legend that is Conan. But guys, I do appreciate you all for checking out this part one of my sword and sorcery films that I'm covering this week. But I guess that's it for tonight, guys. So I really enjoyed doing this video, talking about these films, and I can't wait to talk about 5 more of them this Sunday night. Um, I hope you guys, liked hearing me talk about these movies. I appreciate all you for just checking it out at least. Um, and I want to thank everyone who either watched this live. I want to thank Dana for being in the chat. Um, and anybody that's watching this on replay, thank you guys as well. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite sword and sorcery film is between these 5 movies, or just what it doesn't have to be from these 5 movies. It could be whatever your favorite sword and sorcery film is of all time. Just please let me know and let's have a discussion about that. Um, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button to catch more videos from me like this one. And also, as always, click that bell for any kind of future notifications. And don't forget, tomorrow night, guys, I will be on the Dead Pit Radio YouTube channel as we'll be ranking all of the WrestleMania. So if you're a wrestling fan or if you're interested in learning about wrestling, definitely check that video out. That's, like I said, that's tomorrow night. I think 10 p.m. Eastern time on the Dead Pit Radio YouTube channel. Saturday, I'll be going to the Heroes and Legends event in Prestonsburg, Kentucky. It's a wrestling event. They're going to be having a meet and greet with several wrestlers like Sabu, the Powers of Pain, Ronnie Garvin, Bobby Blaze. And just going to be a really good night for local wrestling here in Eastern Kentucky. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And then again, just to remind you guys again, on Sunday, I'll be doing part 2 of the Sword and Sorcery films here in the 500 movies in 2025. So definitely excited to talk about those films as well this Sunday night. But with all of that said, I'm Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys and have a good night.